My name's Anna Seward and welcome to the Lost Trees podcast, episode 2, in which we'll encounter some quite literally lost trees in a really old orchard dating back to the 1800s. Just to note that this is one in 3 parts of a walk, so if you haven't already, do have a listen to episode 1, in which we discovered some fruit trees growing inconspicuously in built-up areas of the town of Stalybridge. If you've listened to that already, then welcome back. If you want to see something visual as we go, there is a link to the map with some photos from the walk in the episode description. So we start this leg of the walk by rejoining the route up the Gorse Hall coach road, leading up to the historic orchard at the top. It's a long walk up the hill through the Gorse Hall estate, and I paused part of the way up to catch my breath and to take some note of some interesting features to be seen on the way to the orchard. Okay, so I've reached a junction here. The road forks into 2 paths. I think to the right takes you to the old hall and the stables, but I'm going to follow the left fork because that's the original route we were going to follow on our walk. So I'm walking up the wide path. On my right is the fernery. That's like a little stony grotto in a way, where Sam explained to me yesterday that there were probably planted some quite impressive exotic ferns at one time. It was quite a Victorian thing to plant, source exotics if you were rich and try and plant impressive gardens to impress your rich friends. There's not much left of it now apart from the stones and a few what looked to me like pretty native ferns. So I'm just passing that, moving on up towards the orchard. So, following the narrow path up around, you can see on my left the remains of an old building, and we've arrived at what remains of the old kitchen garden. So there's some brick foundations here, which I wonder if they were perhaps an old glass house. They look pretty substantial. So this area was where one end of the kitchen garden, and you can still see quite a lot of foundations. So I think those would be for sheds and for hot houses, for all the exotic plants. And glass houses. So they'd probably be growing, well, Sam thought they might be growing pineapples and things in here. And then behind that is the orchard. So I'm walking up to the top now, and it opens out into grassland, really quite open, a few scattered trees, but really nice open area. And from the top here, I'm not going to go up there now, but it is absolutely stunning views at the top. Really nice place to have a pause on this walk. There's a pond with a bench next to it, so that's a good place to have a little rest. And I'm heading towards the orchard gate now. So that's the access point to the Gorse Hall orchard. From this point, I'll pick up from when I visited the orchard with Sam Bolton. He's an ecologist working at Greater Manchester Ecology Unit, who we met in the last episode, and he talked about his link with this orchard. So just a quick reminder on that, Sam completed a research study of this orchard as part of a wider fruit tree restoration project in Greater Manchester in 2013 called Grafting for Orchards. He hadn't visited this orchard since doing some planting there 8 or 9 years ago, so it was really interesting to look around with him for trees that he'd identified in his research back then. Just to note also that the orchard isn't currently accessible to the public, and the entrance gate is kept locked, so unless you come as a volunteer, you won't be able to explore it as we did. However, from the gate you can see into the first section, an area that's cut back and maintained by the Friends group. After visiting this part, we then proceed into other parts of the orchard which can't be seen from the gate and are much more overgrown. This was recording in action, so expect plenty of rustling and discussion as we move about in search of some trees that we think could be well over 150 years old. Okay, so there's a sign here that explains about the orchard. It says that as part of the restoration of the orchard, we've been trying to identify the original fruit varieties. These included Lord Suffield and Margaret apple. So were you involved in that?
I was, yeah. So we worked with the Northern Fruit Group to try and identify some, and also we sent some off to Brogdale to be identified as well. So Brogdale's the home of apples in the UK. So they have hundreds of varieties of different apples, and they'll work out the variety for you just by looking at them. It's not through DNA testing or anything like that, although you can do that now. We found out some of the varieties, some weren't really in a good enough condition to work out what they were. It's quite interesting really, because even the ones that we did find out, so the Lord Suffield and the Margaret, so the Lord Suffield will be still ready November time, December, whereas the Margaret is a super early one, and would be ready sort of July time. So the idea being, I should imagine, was that they wanted as longer growing season as possible, so they would have had different varieties that were ready at different times, some to eat now, some to store later. Margaret's a super bad storer, so when it falls off the tree, it rots pretty much within a week. It's gone. Right, so it's got a super tiny window. That's probably why you hardly see it anywhere, because in terms of it being commercially viable, Margaret's a total no-no. So
for modern uses, yeah.
Yeah. But whereas somewhere like Gorse Hall, where it's going straight into the house and it's going to be used straight away, then it works for those 2 weeks or so when it's in season.
And that was the value of a lot of these older heritage varieties, was that some might look a bit weird, but they stored really well, or stored really well, or juiced really well, or baked well. And I guess with this hall, there was probably they would have liked some quirkiness in them, in that people like to have different fruit to show off to people that came round as well. So like with the fernery, it was all about kind of quite a lot of showing off.
Yeah, definitely. So there would be some practical applications to the apples, but I think the more quirky different varieties you had, I'm sure that would have been a talking point around the table.
And so it refers here on the sign to, where possible, we're planting new trees from grafts. Some old varieties include Caroline, named after Lord Suffield's wife, and Pot seedling, which was developed in Ashton. So did you plant those in here?
Yes, so there should be.
So we're going to have a look at those.
There should be some.
Now. Brilliant. Okay, let's go in. Let's hope the gate's open. So we're going in the gate now. Down a little step. It's pretty uneven round here, as I remember, so we've got to go carefully.
There was a wall that ran along that they'd grown espaliers on, and a fruit that liked more sun as well. So they may have had plums and maybe figs. And they did have a glass house, I think, on one side of this as well, so they could have had more exotic fruits growing on there as well. Maybe pineapples, you don't know.
Wow. So we're in a section, we just walked through the gate, and there's a kind of section before you get to the main bit of the orchard, which I think, if I'm right, runs along as a strip along, and then there's a series of sections in front of that. That's
right. So we never really found any fruit trees in this main long strip that runs parallel to the orchard. But this is where they've uncovered a well as well.
Right, okay. Let's have a look.
Don't fall down.
No. I will try not to.
You can't see it, but there's a big stone circle all the way around here where there was a well.
So it's pretty overgrown, there's a lot of brambles, so it's hidden, but I can see stones, sort of mossy stones underneath all that, so great. So that makes sense for a kitchen garden. Right, and now we're going along the path and down some steps. So this right ahead of us, I believe, is a pear. Is that right?
That's right, yep.
And did this ever get identified in terms of its variety?
No, because it hasn't fruited, or didn't fruit when I was.
Apparently it fruited this year.
Oh, right, okay. Well, that's good.
Could that be a pear?
This is a pear. You can tell the difference between apples and pears fairly easily by the buds. So can you see this bud here? It's really pointy. So
Yeah.
that's a pear, whereas apples tend to have a more of a rounded bud.
Yeah.
But also they have different forms a lot of the time as well.
Yeah, don't they grow more
Upright,
upwards?
yeah. So
yeah, I've noticed that in the Hyde Park orchard. Yeah.
pears have a lot more upright form, whereas apples have a more spreading form.
Yeah.
And you've got to take that into account when you're pruning them, so you make sure that they grow into the right places.
That's exciting then. Next year maybe we'll know what this pear tree is. Okay, so we're just going through to the other corner now. This, what do you think this is?
This is an apple, but
Oh, right.
it was more of an ornamental apple again.
So not for eating?
Well, eating, you can still eat them. You can eat all apples,
Yeah.
but it's more of a smaller crab apple. So here's your espaliers, or attempts at espaliers.
Yeah, so we saw those in the summer when they were in full leaf, and they look pretty good actually. Somebody's been keeping them a bit reasonably under control, haven't they?
Yeah. So with espaliers, you do need to keep them under control. So usually you prune espaliers and cordons and steps twice a year. You'll prune them in winter, and you'll prune them in the summer as well, just to try and help them to keep their shape. But you do need to keep on top of them, because they grow so fast, because they can get away and get whippy, and that's what you don't want, because they don't have the strength in them to hold the fruit that grows on them. And also when it's windy they'll blow and bash
break
against each other, and you get damage into the fruit, which is damage into the fruit trees, which is obviously one thing you don't want. You get disease into it, and then they'll die.
So these varieties, do you remember what these ones were? Were these the pot seedlings and the Caroline?
Caroline. So there will have been, and we selected some other heritage varieties. There was a wide range of different ones, and we tried to pick a mix of ones that flowered early and late as well, so you could have more nectar sources and pollen sources for pollinators. So these sort of orchards generally aren't ever going to be used for large fruit production, or for they're not feeding the house anymore. A lot of them is for local interest and local wildlife as well. So what scion wood we could get from the trees that were still here were grafted onto trees that are in the orchard now. So there will be some more Lord Suffields and some more Margarets to replace the ones that are here that have died. So I should say a scion is a piece of wood that you cut off of the tree that you want to carry on producing the apples for, and it's what this year's growth is the scion wood. So it's not 2-year-old or 3-year-old. It has to be young, new growth, and then you graft that onto some rootstock, and that's the only way that you can guarantee that you'll get the same apple. So if you got a Granny Smith and you took the pip from it and planted it in the ground, you wouldn't get a Granny Smith that would come back. You'd get something slightly different, or something really different.
You don't know what you get, basically.
You don't know what you get.
No.
So that's why you graft trees.
And grafting's a sort of winter activity.
Winter activity. So you do it whilst the trees are dormant, but as close as possible to the trees, the sap starting to flow again within the tree, and so there's less chance of the scion wood that you've taken off of your trees dying. And so
late winter.
So you tend to cut them off sort of February time and graft them like March time. What you can do is cheat a bit and cut them off earlier and keep them in the fridge, and then graft them.
Great, that's a more practical solution. So if you were say, restoring this orchard further, what would you recommend could be done here, for example?
I guess more light into the orchard.
Because these aren't fruit trees here, are they?
Well, they are and they aren't. There's 2 cherries,
Okay.
so they produce fruit, but I'd say these are likely to be seedlings, so bird sown wild cherries.
Okay.
There are some really huge cherries at the back if they're still there, and I did wonder whether they were original. But
Yeah.
cherries grow quite quickly, but die quite quickly as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's difficult to tell how these are.
So definitely that's an original tree. The pear.
This pear is. This
And the
this
crab apple.
Yeah, in the corner.
So are we going to attempt to go into the next
Yes, let's
section?
attempt to go to the next.
Okay. This is quite adventurous because it's very overgrown. Let's go. So we're climbing through some overgrowth now. Just a bit of rhododendron.
Lots of bramble.
Lots of bramble. Okay.
So that's the case this orchard. This tree here was still alive.
That was a tree.
Yeah, it was a
Oh.
huge apple tree that came across.
And did you manage to identify that?
No.
Oh, it's really sad.
Yeah, it didn't produce anything. We tried to cut bits of the branches off to get some decent wood to graft it onto,
Yeah.
and it just didn't. There wasn't anything that was really graftable.
Yeah. But there is a value, isn't there, in leaving this dead tree
Yeah,
there?
absolutely.
Because that is quite important to understand it.
Try and leave deadwood where it is, because either standing deadwood or deadwood on the floors, brilliant for deadwood invertebrates, and that in turn is good for insects and sources for birds and the like. So yeah, deadwood invertebrates are great, and you get it's a beetle. It's called the noble chafer beetle,
Yeah.
if I remember rightly, which potentially you could get in this orchard, which would be quite cool. So there's another apple there
I'm getting brambled, hang on.
in the corner.
Oh,
So-
okay. So that...
Yeah, that off the top of my head was the Lord Suffield. All these 3 stems are all one tree.
Okay.
So that stem has come all the way over. So that's
Oh, right. Okay. So 1, 2, 3.
yeah.
So that's grown in quite an unusual way. Is that because it's kind of dropped and then grown upwards? Sort
Yeah, that's right. One of the branches would have come off.
Because it has still got leaves on it, actually.
Yep, and it's got lots of good growth on there.
Wow.
So it was probably kept up to quite well until 110 years ago, when it was just abandoned, and so the form then would have suffered because it wouldn't have been pruned well, and so it might have been that the branches come over and snapped, or it's not been looked after. So yeah, you're in this sort of really
It'd be good to be able to get in a bit closer, but I don't think we can we?
old and damaged state.
But it couldn't have one bit growing out of the bottom of the rootstock or anything like that.
It could do, and you get that loads.
Yeah, and they're often more strong growing, aren't they? the
Yeah,
rootstock?
yeah. So definitely, you'll see that an awful lot, where you'll have a small old tree, which you think might be the rootstock, but that's the original tree, and then this huge, especially with pears, this huge pear tree right next to it, and that's the rootstock that's growing up. There's a really big pear orchard, Etherow Country Park, that's like that, where most of the pears are the rootstock rather than the original pears, unfortunately.
So they're really old, quite old trees.
So that tree is definitely, I'd say, almost 100% part of the original orchard. So a good 150 years old.
Wow. So, and probably not all rootstock growth. There's probably some Lord Suffield there.
Definitely not. Should we carry on?
Yep, let's carry on.
So we've got a patch of raspberries.
So are we in the soft fruits bit now.
There's part of the orchard has soft fruits, or would have had soft fruits. I think it's a bit of a coincidence that there's a massive patch of raspberries here still.
Yes.
And they look a bit quirky, if you know what I mean. They don't seem to be
necessarily a modern variety.
No, especially like this one here. Like you see, there's no thorns on it at all. That's definitely a cult. Yeah. Yeah, you do get thornless raspberries.
Yeah.
Like, but none whatsoever. So it may be a remnant from the kitchen garden.
So you reckon that's the second section, and then we're into the third section now, because I can see a bit of a wall running along here.
Yeah, and then we can sort of get up and through here.
Okay.
So yeah, I think there were soft fruits in this section, because you've got currants here as well.
Right.
So again, these are remnants of the kitchen garden.
So that tree there that's fallen over.
Sorry?
Is that not an apple tree?
This is a Margaret.
Okay. Right, there was a lot of debate about this when we.
Yeah. In my head, this was a Margaret, because this is the one that goes over really, really quickly.
Yeah.
And you just don't.
And I'm pretty sure that had apples on it when we came to visit in July.
Yeah.
They were small, but they were there. So that's been grafted from already. So that's great that that's still going.
There's this really, really big cherry that's there.
That?
Yeah. That's still going. I think that potentially could be original, because it's just so huge.
Yeah, it looks really. That's got a very fat stem.
Yeah, but having said that, say they do grow really quickly.
Yeah.
So a 100-year-old cherry is pretty impressive.
So you can see the wall a lot clearer actually now as well, the boundary.
So we're in the bottom right-hand corner. So there would have been fruit that was growing on here as well. But I suspect that they wouldn't have lasted, because they're more likely to have been grown on a dwarf rootstock.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so or
they don't live as long, do they?
No, or they would have been closhed, so had glass around them, or there would have been a greenhouse here, so they wouldn't have.
Nothing would have lasted as long as the apples on sort of standard rootstocks.
So can you see here?
Oh yeah.
There's a tree, and this is the rootstock.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah. That makes sense.
From this tree that died.
Oh, sad. And so that we don't know what that was.
No. Can you see there's another big stem there of a tree that's now gone, unfortunately.
So that could have been another fruit tree.
Yeah, I'd say so.
So actually the orchard does probably go down a little bit further than here, maybe.
Yeah.
But because the Japanese knotweed, you just can't see, can you?
And also, can you see here again, there's all this box hedging?
Yeah, so that suggests that's the boundary.
I think that would have been the base,
the
base of it, where they would have had hedging. And then the other side, you've got the stone wall where they've grown things.
So it would have looked quite formal and.
Yeah, very much so. You can see on the old maps how it was laid out.
Yeah. So, as you heard just there, we'd come to the end of the orchard at this point, but I was given a copy of the map that Sam mentions there, and we've uploaded a copy of that online to look at. So, having had a good look around as much of the orchard as we could, Sam and I found a bench nearby and we talked further about the value of community orchards, especially older heritage orchards.
Orchards have value in terms of ecology and heritage and health and well-being. Especially old orchards are really important. They hold lots of heritage varieties, so apple varieties and pears and other top fruit that might not necessarily be commercially viable nowadays, so they won't have a really long shelf life, or they might bruise quite easily, or generally just not look as nice as some other fruit. And so from a commercial point of view, aren't used anymore, and so these varieties aren't really grown in any sort of large amounts. But when you had your kitchen garden right next to your house, and if it was just supplying that one house, then you could have fruit trees that provided fruit that only lasted a couple of weeks, and that was fine. So that's what we see at Gorse Hall for some of the trees that remain in, and you can see on the layouts where they had a lot more trees and would have had a lot more trees, and so they would have had trees that fruited at different times throughout the year, and we talked about that before with the Margaret and the Lord Suffield fruiting and being available at different times, so they would have had fruit right throughout the year. But yeah, I should imagine that it'd have been quite nice for the people that stayed in the house as well to wander up through the orchard and see the different blossoms that come out at different times, and the wildlife that would have been in the orchard. It would have been quite a nice place to retreat for them as well, and is now, I'd say, with the volunteers that come out and look after Gorse Hall. It's something different, something quirky. It's something that gives them that link back to the past. I suppose if I was a volunteer picking apples from that orchard and taking them home and having a pie, it's pretty cool that you could think that same tree supplied a quite nice country house in Stalybridge where you lived 150 years ago, and you're taking the same apples from the same tree and doing the same thing, but in a totally different time than what happened. So
yeah, lots happened since then.
Yeah, totally. In terms of wildlife, old fruit trees are super great for wildlife. So you get a lot of dead wood that falls off the trees, and you'll have standing dead wood as well. So you get loads of great deadwood invertebrates that you'll find on old fruit trees, and they in turn support a lot of birds that will feed on those insects. So that's super important as well.
So if you're looking at restoring an older orchard, you'd want to leave perhaps some of that older wood there for the ecological value.
Yes, yeah. So there is a bit of a play-off in that if you were maintaining an orchard for just fruit production, you really wouldn't want to leave dead wood lying around, because potentially it can harbour and bring in disease that in turn could be passed on to the trees that you have in the orchard. But I think wildlife orchards and community orchards are different, especially old heritage ones, where really you're maintaining them not really for fruit production in any way. You know, it is more about that mix of wildlife and past history and
sometimes trying to keep those old varieties going.
There's lots of different varieties around the UK, because just through fate, really, you know, wherever you were in the UK, you wouldn't have travelled super far to get a piece of graft wood to graft onto another tree. Locally, you probably wouldn't have even grafted at all. You would have just spread out all the seeds in a hedgerow, or grown trees from seeds, and the trees that you liked you kept, and the ones that you didn't like you got rid of. And that's what happened most of the time. The grafting and cultivating and cultivars are a relatively recent thing, although you do have some really old Roman apples. Most of the varieties are fairly recent. There would have only been certain nurseries where you'd have got them from. So there's quite a whole history about the earliest known tree or variety. The apples at Gorse Hall might have come from a few places. There was some big local tree nurseries in the area. So there was Beeley's, which was quite a big nursery.
Where was the Beeley's one?
At Bury.
Ah, right, okay.
Yeah, that's still there. Like, it's mad.
Oh,
it's all
wow.
overgrown like this, but there's all the glass houses there and everything.
Really?
Yeah. Like,
But it's not an operating nursery now?
No.
Wow. And that was specifically fruit trees and stuff that they sold?
Yeah, fruit trees and plants as well.
Wow.
Pinkerton's was the main one, and it was in Wigan, and it was huge, and they had loads and loads of really old varieties, and it was right in the centre of Wigan. Wigan has a load of fruit tree history, loads of quirky stuff. There was a woman who kept these handwritten diaries, and she kept a list of all the fruit trees that she had in her orchard, and it's super old. I can't remember how, it's like sort of 17th century old.
Wow.
And so a lot of the lists there are some of the earliest varieties known in the UK, but all those trees came from London. They didn't come from Wigan.
So now, having had a good look around the orchard again, and this being quite a few years since his last work there, I asked Sam what further restoration work he thought could be done in the Gorse Hall orchards going forwards.
You can go forever in orchards, can't you? There's only so much time that you can put into them. But I'd say the things that they could do here is more pruning on the espaliers. That would be good, just so they don't get leggy. The Japanese knotweed that's in here isn't ideal really. That should be removed and treated. You can open more of the grass up and maybe have an in and an out, so you could walk in one way and out the other. That'd be quite nice. But they're all nice to do. So like the trees seem fairly happy. There's hardly any disease in them. This is the new trees. That is the old trees, and they're like there's not too much you can do to bring them back. Other than real gentle bits of pruning here and there, and again just carry on taking grafts from them and trying to get some of the original trees growing as new grafted trees. There's a lot of new trees that have gone in already, and hopefully they'll be here in another 150 years.
And that's where we left our interview. I'd like to say a huge thanks to Sam for taking the time to explore this old orchard again and sharing so much of his knowledge about fruit tree varieties, propagation, ecology, and about the trees in this wonderful old orchard, based on the work that he did during his Grafting for Orchards project. You can find links to a picture gallery showing most of the trees we've talked about in this episode, along with the walk route map in the episode description. Next episode, I'll be speaking to Alan Pickles, who'd been involved for many years with a voluntary friends group who manage the Gorse Hall estate. He's really knowledgeable about the history of the site, which gives some really interesting insights and context to the orchard there. Then we'll complete the final part of the Lost Trees Walk, including a more recently planted community orchard situated not far away, with a very different story to tell. So, join us for all that in episode 3. Thanks again to Sam Bolton for his brilliant contribution to this episode. Also to Sam and Galloway for editing and sound production, and to Claire Knox for creating the beautiful music to accompany it. This podcast and the Lost Trees project is supported by The Bridge, Stalybridge Heritage Action Zone Cultural Consortium, and it was funded by Historic England.